A woman in Upper Egypt is lighting her bread oven. The kindling she is using is pages from the most important religious document discovered in the 20th century. She cannot read them. Her son brought them home from a dig site a few days ago and dumped them in the courtyard. He couldn't read them either. He'd cracked open a sealed clay jar under a cliff and pulled out 13 leather-bound books and had no idea what he was holding. So his mother used some of the loose pages to start the fire. The document is the Gospel of Thomas. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. No birth narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just words, direct, unframed, and in some places so unlike anything in your Bible that the institutional church had been calling them, officially, impious and absurd for over 1,000 years before that woman lit her oven. What she burned, nobody knows. What survived, we can read. And what it says is the reason this document spent 1,600 years in a sealed jar under a boulder in the Egyptian desert rather than on the shelf next to your Bible. This is not the story of a lost gospel. It is the story of a buried one. And the difference between lost and buried is everything. Lost means it disappeared. Buried means someone hid it on purpose. And when you understand who hid it and what was coming for it, and what the text actually says in its original Greek that made 3 generations of church fathers line up to condemn it by name, the burial starts to look less like suppression and more like the most defiant act of theological preservation in the history of Christianity. By the end of this video, you will know why the woman's son hesitated before breaking that jar. You will know the name of the bishop whose letter may have put it there. You will know what the Greek word logoi means and why it made the 4th century church more nervous than open heresy. And you will know what the text says about where you can find God, in terms so specific and so immediate that the institution has had 1,600 years of very good reasons to make sure you weren't reading it unsupervised. The pages that burned are gone. The ones that didn't are still asking the same question they were asking the day they went into the ground. Before we open the text, we need to establish something that almost every popular account of this story gets backwards. The Gospel of Thomas was not underground for 1,600 years because everyone forgot about it. It was underground because people remembered it perfectly well and decided it was dangerous. Here is the evidence. January 12, 1897. Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, 2nd day of excavation. 2 Oxford scholars, Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Surridge Hunt, are digging through ancient garbage heaps and pull out a single papyrus fragment. They date the handwriting to, probably not much later than the year 200 AD. They publish it the same year under the title Logia Eso, Sayings of Our Lord. The fragment contains words attributed to Jesus that do not match any canonical gospel exactly. One line, in particular, stops them, "Raise the stone, and there you shall find me. Split the wood, and there I am." They find 2 more Greek fragments at Oxyrhynchus over the following years, more sayings, more near parallels to canonical texts, more lines with no canonical source at all. They have no idea what they are holding. Scholars argue about the origin of these fragments for nearly 50 years. Then, December 1945, Muhammad Ali al-Samman, a farmer in Upper Egypt who has just killed a man in a blood feud and is weeks away from being jailed for it, rides his camel to the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff to dig for fertilizer. His mattock hits something hard, a sealed red earthenware jar, almost a meter tall. He hesitates. A sealed jar buried under a boulder means a jinn, a spirit. Then he thinks about gold. He swings the mattock. What flies out is a cloud of disintegrating papyrus, golden in the light. 13 leather-bound volumes. He takes them home. His mother uses the loose pages for the bread oven. He sells what's left on the black market. The manuscripts move through antiquities dealers and government offices and eventually reach the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where scholars begin translation. When they lay the Oxyrhynchus Greek fragments next to the Nag Hammadi Coptic text, the argument that has been running since 1897 ends in an afternoon. The fragments Grenfell and Hunt found in an Egyptian garbage heap were 3 separate manuscript copies of the Gospel of Thomas, circulating in Egypt, in Greek, no later than the early 3rd century, which means the document they were copying was already old enough to have been reproduced and distributed across a region. This text was not obscure. It was not marginal. It was circulating widely enough to leave 3 separate manuscript traces in one Egyptian city's rubbish. And 3 generations of church fathers had been condemning it by name. Hippolytus of Rome, around 225 AD. Origen of Alexandria, around 233 AD. Eusebius of Caesarea, around 311 AD. Each of them names the Gospel of Thomas. Each of them has read it. Each of them tells the communities under their influence to stay away from it. This is not a document that slipped through the cracks. It is a document that somebody kept dragging back to the surface, century after century, and somebody else kept pushing back down. The question is why? And the answer is in the Greek. The Gospel of Thomas opens with a prologue. In the Coptic text, found at Nag Hammadi, it reads, "These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down." Hidden sayings. That word, hidden, is doing work. It is not claiming the text is esoteric or secret in the sense of being locked behind initiation. It is claiming that the sayings have a surface and a depth, and that reading them is an act of excavation, not reception. You are not supposed to receive these words. You are supposed to find them. But the word that changes everything is the one describing what these sayings are. In the Greek version of the text, the one circulating in Egypt, before 200 AD, the sayings of Jesus are called logoi, plural of logos. Now, if you grew up in any tradition that reads the New Testament, you know logos from John 1 verse 1. In the beginning was the logos. Theologians have spent 2,000 years arguing about what John meant. Here is what it did not mean. Casual remark. Anecdote. Teaching point. Logos in Greek, from the time of Herodotus, means word in the deepest available sense, not a sentence. A transmission. The kind of word that carries the weight of reality, rather than merely describing it. The oracular word. The word from which something true about the structure of existence can be extracted if you know how to read it. The Gospel of John applies that word to Jesus himself. The Gospel of Thomas applies it to every single one of his sayings. All 114 of them. Each one, by the document's own claim, a direct transmission of reality from the source of reality. And then it says, whoever finds the interpretation of these logoi will not experience death. Not whoever believes the correct doctrine. Not whoever receives the sacraments through ordained hands. Whoever finds the interpretation, that word, finds, is carrying the entire argument of the document in a single verb. Here is what makes the Gospel of Thomas structurally different from every other early Christian text that was excluded from the canon. An openly heretical document is easy to handle. You identify the doctrine, it denies, you label it. You write the refutation, you move on. The community knows what to avoid, and why. The Gospel of Thomas does not deny canonical doctrine. It does something quieter and far more difficult to contain. It removes the institution from the equation. The four canonical Gospels are shaped documents. They have narrative architecture built in. The crucifixion and resurrection frame everything that comes before them. The Sermon on the Mount has Golgotha in its shadow. These texts were processed through community, liturgy, theological argument, the needs of people trying to transmit a faith across generations of persecution. They are not raw. They are intentionally refined. The Gospel of Thomas has no architecture, no narrative frame, no authorized interpretation waiting at the end. 114 logoi and then silence. You and the words, nothing between you. No priest explaining what the word means. No bishop validating your reading. No council deciding which interpretation is orthodox and which gets you expelled. Think about what that means to the person who has spent their whole life being handed an interpretation from a pulpit and never once told they were allowed to reach a different one. Now think about what it means to the institution handing the interpretation. Here is where most sermons, and most YouTube videos, about the Gospel of Thomas stop. They gesture at the provocative sayings, they imply the church buried something important. And they leave you with a vague sense of institutional corruption, without telling you what the text actually does. That is not this video. We are going to look at the specific sayings that made this document architecturally incompatible with the church the 4th century was building. Not symbolically incompatible, not theologically inconvenient. Architecturally, these are the load-bearing walls of institutional Christianity, and the Gospel of Thomas walks straight through them. The first is saying 3. Jesus says, "If those who lead you say to you, 'Look, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will get there before you. If they say, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will get there before you. Rather, the kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. If those who lead you say," read that opening clause carefully. This is not an attack on false teachers in general. It is a description of a specific structural failure, leaders who redirect the seeker's attention outward toward a location that requires no redirection to find. The kingdom is not in a consecrated building, not in a holy city, not delivered through ordained hands on a liturgical schedule. It is inside you and outside you, present before any institution existed. And present whether any institution authorizes your access to it or not, saying 113 pairs with it at the other end of the document. The disciples ask when the kingdom will come. Jesus answers, "It will not come by waiting for it. No one will say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. Not will be spread out. Not is coming soon, is present tense. Right now, while you are sitting there. These two sayings are the document's first word and last word on its central argument. They bracket everything. And that argument, that the kingdom is interior, immediate, present, and requires no institutional mediation to access, is precisely what the 4th century church was in the process of making untrue. By 367 AD, the church had a sacramental system: baptism, Eucharist, confession, ordination. Each step administered by a credentialed class of clergy whose authority derived from an unbroken chain reaching back to the apostles. You could reach God, but there was a road with checkpoints, and the checkpoints had gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers had the only keys. The Gospel of Thomas is not arguing with the gatekeepers. It is not making a theological case that the road is wrong. It is pointing at a path through the woods that makes the road irrelevant by existing. You cannot refute a path through the woods, you can only hide it. Which brings us to saying 12, the disciples ask Jesus, "Who will lead us when you are gone?" And Jesus says, "Wherever you go, you will go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into existence." James the Just, the brother of Jesus. Not Peter. If you grew up in any tradition with roots in the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Church, and most of Western Protestantism has those roots whether it acknowledges them or not, you were formed inside an authority structure whose entire legal claim rests on apostolic succession, from Peter, Matthew 16 verse 18, "You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." The bishops of Rome traced their authority to that moment through an unbroken chain. The title deed to institutional legitimacy in the Western Church runs through Peter. A document in which Jesus names James does not add a footnote to that structure, it dissolves the title. And here is a thing that should make you stop. This is not a tension the Gospel of Thomas invented, it is already inside the texts the institution accepted. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul describes publicly confronting Peter at Antioch, and winning. In Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council convenes, and it is James who presides, not Peter. The canonical record documents the significance of James in the earliest church. The Gospel of Thomas attributes to Jesus the conclusion those texts make available, but never draw directly. Why is saying 12 still sitting in a document that 6 generations of bishops decided you weren't equipped to handle? That question does not have a comfortable institutional answer. And then there is saying 104. The disciples press Jesus to pray and fast. He says, "What sin have I committed? Or in what way have I been conquered?" Rather, when the bridegroom comes out of the bridal chamber, then let people fast and pray. Fasting, a spiritual discipline, rests on a specific theology of absence. You fast to call attention to a lack, to petition a God who has not yet given something, to demonstrate the seriousness of your need to a divine presence that is somewhere other than here. But if the kingdom is already spread upon the earth, present in split wood, present under lifted stones, inside you and outside you right now, then the entire architecture of petitionary religious practice, addressed to a distant God, is a category error. You are performing absence inside presence. By 367 AD, fasting was not optional. It was regulated by bishops, built into the liturgical calendar. And Athanasius, the bishop whose letter may have put the Nag Hammadi library in the ground, was personally responsible for communicating that calendar to every monastery in Egypt every year. A saying of Jesus that questions the theological foundation of that practice is not a nuisance. It removes one of the primary levers through which the institution demonstrated its authority over the believer's relationship with God. These 3 sayings, the interior kingdom, the James succession, the absence of absence, are not peripheral provocations. They are structural. Each one goes after a different load-bearing wall of the institutional edifice, which is exactly why the response from Eusebius was not "this is disputed," or "this is spurious." It was, "this should be discarded as impious and absurd." Impious. That word is precise. Something is impious not merely when it is wrong, but when it contradicts the structure of the sacred, when it puts the holy thing in the wrong place, administered by the wrong people, accessed by the wrong means. The Gospel of Thomas is impious to the institution because it says the holy thing is already where you are. No mediation required. Now, I want to be fair to the men who condemned this text, because they deserve fair treatment, and because the argument against Thomas is not nothing. Hippolytus of Rome had a specific problem with a specific saying. He documented the Nacenes, a group he classified as Gnostic heretics, quoting the Gospel of Thomas to support their theology. And he argued, with textual evidence, that the specific saying they were quoting was not original to Jesus at all but was a garbled version of a medical aphorism from Hippocrates. That is a legitimate scholarly argument. Whether it applies to the whole document is another question. Origen of Alexandria had a principled criterion. The communities he trusted had always treated four Gospels as authoritative, and Thomas had no attestation in any of them. A consistent tradition of apostolic usage was his measuring stick. Thomas failed it. That is a defensible position. Eusebius of Caesarea built the most systematic attempt anyone had made to sort the Christian writings by authority. He tracked which texts the earliest witnesses cited approvingly, which they disputed, which they ignored, and which they condemned. The Gospel of Thomas appeared in the condemned category in every source he had access to. By his methodology, the rejection is consistent and documented. These were not intellectually shallow men, they had reasons. But here is where Eusebius's methodology runs into a problem he cannot fully see from where he is sitting. His evidence is only as complete as the records he has access to. And those records are themselves the product of a tradition that had been moving in a specific direction for a century before he wrote. The silence of the earliest witnesses about Thomas might mean the document didn't exist yet, or it might mean the communities that used it didn't produce the kind of literary correspondence that ended up on Eusebius's shelves. We cannot know which, and that uncertainty matters. What the Oxyrhynchus papyri establish is this. The Greek Gospel of Thomas was old enough, by 200 AD, to have been copied multiple times across Egypt. That is not what happens to a document composed the previous generation. Something earlier existed. The dating debate among scholars is genuinely unresolved. Historians like Simon Gathercole of Cambridge place composition in the middle to late 2nd century. Scholars like Elaine Pagels of Princeton and John Dominic Crossan argue for an earlier 1st century sayings tradition at the root. The composition dates proposed range from 60 AD to 250 AD, a spread of nearly 200 years. Here is what I find persuasive. 13 of the 16 parables in the Gospel of Thomas also appear in the Synoptic Gospels. But when you lay Thomas's versions next to their canonical parallels, Thomas is consistently simpler, less interpreted, stripped of the theological overlays the canonical authors have built in. The parable of the sower in Thomas is shorter and less explained than Matthew's version. When two versions of the same saying exist, one simple and one developed, the simple version generally predates the developed one. That pattern holds across too many sayings to explain by a 2nd century author working backward from canonical sources. Something older is present in this text. What it is, exactly, and how directly it connects to the historical Jesus, that is where the honest answer is still, we don't know. Anyone who tells you it's settled is telling you what they need it to be. What is not in dispute is that somebody thought it was worth preserving. Through multiple generations of copying, through the condemnations of Hippolytus and Origen and Eusebius, all the way to the moment when someone sealed it in clay and buried it rather than hand it over. You don't preserve what you think is worthless through that much effort. January 7th, 367 AD. The most powerful bishop in the Eastern Church is writing his annual Easter letter. His name is Athanasius of Alexandria. He has been exiled from his episcopal office 5 times by 5 different emperors. He has outlasted every one of them. He will hold the bishop's seat in Alexandria for 45 years, 328 to 373 AD, in the ancient world. That kind of institutional endurance is not luck. That is a man who understands power at a cellular level. Every year, the Bishop of Alexandria writes to every church and monastery in his jurisdiction, announcing the date of Easter. These festal letters are mandatory correspondence. Every community receives them. They are read aloud, they are filed, they are followed. Athanasius writes 45 of them. His 39th, written for Easter of 367 AD, is the one that changed the history of what you're allowed to read. In it, Athanasius does something no bishop had done in quite this form. He produces a list. 27 books, the exact 27 books in every New Testament in every Christian tradition today. Then he closes the list with a sentence, "Let no one add to these. Let nothing be taken away from them." Bruce Metzger of Princeton, one of the 20th century's most authoritative New Testament textual critics, wrote this about that moment. The year 367 marks the first time that the scope of the New Testament canon is declared to be exactly the 27 books accepted today as canonical. One man, one Easter letter, one list. Then Athanasius condemns every other text circulating in the monasteries under his jurisdiction. He calls them apocryphal, his word carrying the connotation of fabrications. He instructs the bishops under him to remove these documents from any context where they might be treated as authoritative. Now look at the geography. The Pachomian monastery at Chernoboscion sits between 5 and 9 kilometers from the cliff where Muhammad Ali al-Saman's mattock struck clay in December 1945. The carbon dating of the Nag Hammadi leather bindings places them in the late 4th century, between 20 and 50 years after Athanasius's letter would have arrived at that monastery. James Robinson, the scholar who tracked down Muhammad Ali al-Saman in the 1970s and heard the story of the discovery from the man who broke the jar, argues that the codices most likely belonged to monks at that monastery. That when Athanasius's letter arrived, those monks made a choice. They did not burn the books, they sealed them in clay, carried them to the cliff, buried them, then walked away. I want to hold this with honest uncertainty. The Pachomian connection is plausible and widely held among scholars, but it is not proven. Some researchers argue the codices may have come from private individuals, deposited as grave goods in a late antique Egyptian practice well documented in the region. But here is what is not a theory. Athanasius's letter exists. His condemnation of non-canonical texts is in it, explicitly. The monks received that letter. The jar was buried within walking distance of the monastery, within decades of the letter's arrival. And inside it, a document that 3 generations of bishops had been calling heretical, whatever the intention behind the burial, defiance, reverence, safekeeping, or something we don't have a word for. Someone made a choice not to destroy, and that choice is the only reason the woman at the bread oven had pages to burn in December 1945. The pages she didn't burn are the ones you can read tonight. Before you decide that the burial was either heroic resistance or naive superstition, ask yourself the question the burial itself asks. If the document was obviously false, if it was the forgery Eusebius called it, the impious absurdity he said should simply be discarded, why would anyone put it in clay? You burn garbage, you bury treasure. Here is the part of this story that nobody puts in a popular account. The most dangerous saying in the Gospel of Thomas is not the one about the kingdom being inside you. It is not the one naming James instead of Peter. It is the one that nobody can argue with, because it doesn't make an argument. Saying 77. The Greek fragments of this saying were the ones sitting in Grenfell and Hunt's garbage heap for 50 years before anyone knew what to do with them. In the full Nag Hammadi text it reads, "I am the light that is above them all. I am the all. From me came all, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me there. Split a piece of wood." I want to be precise about what this is before you read something else into it. This is not Gnosticism. The Gnostic system taught that matter is evil, that the physical world is a prison created by a lesser deity, and the divine spark must escape it. If that were this saying's theology, the divine would be absent from wood and stone, hidden from matter, needing to be extracted from it. Saying 77 teaches the opposite. The divine is present in the grain of ordinary timber, present under the rock in your backyard, not behind a veil in a temple, not reserved for holy sites, not administered on a schedule by ordained hands. Immediately, physically, stubbornly present in the most ordinary material of the world, the kind of material a first-century Galilean builder worked with every day. Think about where that leaves the institution. If you can find God by picking up a stone, not the stone at the entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, not a stone blessed by a bishop, just any stone right there, then every pilgrimage, every sacred building, every sacrament requiring a credentialed minister becomes, at minimum, optional. The institution doesn't become wrong, it becomes redundant. There is a kind of threat that is harder to defend against than a frontal attack, and it is the threat of being made unnecessary. You can refute heresy. You cannot refute a statement that simply points at the ground and says, the thing you were paying to access is right here. And here is the detail I don't know what to do with. The Greek fragments of saying 77, the ones about split wood and lifted stones, were found by Grenfell and Hunt in an ancient garbage dump. The saying about finding God in the most ordinary material of the world survived inside a rubbish heap for almost 2,000 years. I am not making a theological claim about that. I am noting that I cannot unnotice it. Now I need to dismantle something you may have already heard, because it is going to come up. There is a story, and by this point it has reached the level of cultural background noise, that the Emperor Constantine, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, gathered the bishops and ordered them to vote on which books belonged in the Bible. The winners stayed. The losers, including the Gospel of Thomas, were politically suppressed by an emperor building a state religion. This story is false, not exaggerated, not simplified, false at the level of basic historical fact. The Council of Nicaea did not discuss the biblical canon. The council's primary business was the Arian controversy, whether Christ was of the same substance as the Father or a subordinate created being. We have eyewitness accounts of that council. Eusebius attended and wrote about it extensively. No one mentions a vote on books, because there was no vote on books. The fiction originated in a forged medieval document called the Synodicon Vetus. Voltaire picked it up in the 18th century as a rhetorical weapon against the Church. Dan Brown put it in a 2003 novel. It spread because it felt true, because it matched a story people already wanted to believe about power and suppression and conspiracy. But desire for a story is not evidence of its truth. That is, incidentally, exactly what the Gospel of Thomas's critics said about the document itself. The canon was not decided at a dramatic council. It accumulated over 3 centuries through a slow, contested, non-linear process of communities comparing notes about which text they considered authoritative. The process left real open questions. Revelation almost didn't make it. Hebrews was disputed for centuries. The Shepherd of Hermas was recommended reading by Athanasius himself, even though he didn't include it in his list. The exclusion of the Gospel of Thomas was not a conspiracy. It was a consistent, accumulated judgment by serious scholars who found it theologically incompatible with the apostolic tradition, as they understood it. That judgment can be questioned, but it cannot be replaced by a story that did not happen, because replacing one false narrative with another is not the same as finding the truth. And finding the truth is what this channel, and, according to its opening line, the Gospel of Thomas itself, is actually for. Let me come back now to where this video started. A woman in Upper Egypt. A bread oven. Pages she cannot read, going up in smoke. She doesn't know she is burning words attributed to Jesus. She doesn't know her son found them under a cliff that sat 5 kilometers from a monastery that had received a bishop's letter about books like this, 1600 years earlier. She doesn't know that those pages, or something very like them, had been copied by scribes in Greek before the year 200 and circulated in the same region her ancestors lived in. She doesn't know any of it. She needs to start the fire. The pages are there. What survived the fire is the question the document has been asking since the day it went into the ground. And now I want to ask it directly to you, because this is the part of the Gospel of Thomas that no one in the institutional church has any incentive to sit down and apply to your actual life. The first saying, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Not whoever joins the right church, not whoever submits to the right authority, not whoever fasts on the right days or receives the right sacraments. Whoever finds, an active verb, a thing you do, something the institution cannot do on your behalf. The second to last saying, answering the question of when the kingdom comes, it is already spread upon the earth, and people do not see it. Not will come, not is coming soon if you remain faithful, is now, here. How many of you have spent years inside a tradition that told you the thing you most needed was somewhere you had to earn your way to, through the right attendance, the right doctrine, the right deference to the right leadership, and you sat there nodding and feeling, underneath the nod, like something important was being missed? Not because the tradition was lying, because the tradition was pointing you at the sky when the thing you were looking for was under the stone at your feet. That feeling has a name. It has a history. It has a Greek word, and that Greek word spent 1600 years in a sealed clay jar under a boulder in Upper Egypt, because someone decided it was worth preserving even when the most powerful bishop in the Eastern Church said to get rid of it. The monks who buried it did not know when it would come back into the light. They may not have believed it would. They buried it anyway. The woman who burned the loose pages did not know what she was burning. The pages that mattered survived anyway. Saying 5. Know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be disclosed to you. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. The monks believed that. They sealed the jar and walked away. They trusted the clay and the time, and whatever comes after time. 1600 years later, a farmer who couldn't read the pages inside swung a mattock and broke the seal open. You can read them now. What you do with that is not this channel's decision to make. It never was. That is the whole point. The full scholarly translation of the Gospel of Thomas is in the Nag Hammadi Library in English, edited by James Robinson. The physical manuscripts are held at the Coptic Museum in Cairo. The Greek Oxyrhynchus fragments, the ones that came out of a garbage heap in 1897 and baffled scholars for 50 years, are at the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the British Museum. You can look at them. You should look at them, not through the filter of men who had institutional reasons to tell you what to think before you opened the page. Directly. The next video on this channel follows what else went into the ground when Athanasius closed the list, what the monasteries were sheltering, what the letter was responding to, and what the 4th century church was so determined to leave behind that it took a bishop's Easter announcement to bury it. That one is there when you are ready.